All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Best Address Show. It's May 15th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that means it's the Best Address Show with Scott Sullivan, your moderator, and Joe Himali, the star.
That's me.
Yeah. So this is going to be a fun once-a-month live show that we do. It will be Joe and I, all different kinds of things we're going to do. It depends on the month. This month, it's a Q&A.
Right.
Next month, we don't know yet. But when we know,
we'll let you know.
We'll let you know. What else? We're going to answer some questions from folks that have already posted them to Joe. And also, if you haven't done that and you'd like to ask a question, just use the chat section on YouTube there. And Nadia will pick the best question and she will ask it and you'll win a prize. And Joe will also pick a prize of the best question that he gets of the ones that I ask him from people who've already submitted questions. And then, Joe, you'll announce two prizes at the end. One for Nadia's question and one for the one that you liked here.
Exactly.
All right. So we're going to do this for about a half hour. Sit back, enjoy the ride. Joe, I'm going to ask you your first question.
Well, before we do, I want to tell what the prize is.
Yeah, please.
So I've got a deck of playing cards that I created. They're of historic buildings in Washington, D.C., and it's a custom deck of playing cards. And I only have about 12 of them left. So you'll get the last one of the dozen decks of cards left. So
perfect.
And we'll mail it to you. I'll DM you and then you can give me an address and I'll mail it to you.
And all of you have submitted questions to deal with architecture and design and decor. Dozens and dozens of questions were submitted. I picked just a few. And the first one that I picked, Joe, is how did you come to discover your passion for architecture and history behind all the landmarks that you highlight in your videos? That's from @Gabriella.src.
Well, thank you for the question. So, you know, when I was a kid growing up, I grew up in a 1972 modernist house, which was not my style at all. And I remember in the early 80s, I started watching This Old House, and it had Bob Vila. And I thought it was fun and interesting to learn about these things. But what really set me on the path was Bob Vila went to a antiques warehouse where it was not just antiques, but sort of salvage. And he went through and was looking at all these salvage pieces in this massive warehouse with clawfoot tubs and marble vanities and all sorts of things. And I thought, my God, that's so cool. So seeing that, I was like, there's so many cool designs and cool and interesting things that are out there that you just don't see in a 1972 new built house. And ironically, now I look back on it and, you know, that was 52 years ago. And now I look back on that house and now people look at that design. My clients today look at that design, go, I love historic homes, like the thing. And I'm like, oh my God, you know,
you've become historic.
I am now officially historic. I'm an antique. And so I just really love those designs. So once I graduated from college and
but wait a minute, before you talk about college, here you are, a teenager into the, like, where did it come from? Like a lot of the things that I got interested in when I was young came from other people who introduced me to it. Like, where were you, who introduced you to all of these interesting things?
It was literally just stumbling across This Old House and watching it and just being blown away. And
so Bob Vila literally inspired you.
Yes. Yeah. Bob Vila and just the way that they took an old house and renovated. I really liked that. My father also did some woodworking and that sort of stuff. So I'd seen him build shelves and a workbench with him.
Were you like one of those kids who loved Legos?
I did love Legos, and I still love Legos. I still build Legos. So yes. Yeah. And my Legos now are of houses. So I get the Lego sets of the house, streetscape, and look at the architectural design of that. It's fun.
And I'm curious because you have such an eye for architecture and you notice things that no one else ever seems to notice. And I've witnessed this with you on tours and in other situations. Like when you approach an architectural specimen, what's the first thing you look for that's going to wow you? Like what wows you when you see an interesting architectural design?
Well, I think it's really just, I walk back. Generally, when I go look at something I've never seen before, I will stand right in front of it and just look at the whole thing and just sort of try to take it in. So it's really just stepping back and reflecting on where that building, assuming it's a house, you look at the house, you sort of take the house in, and then you look around and see where it is in relation to the other houses and how it relates to them. So if you're in, Cape May, New Jersey, and it's got lots of Victorians, then you look around the block and it really makes sense that there are a lot of Victorians there. And that tells you a bit about the history that area all was homogenous at the time it was built. And then you can go to other places. For instance, when I was in Hartford, Connecticut, and I went and saw the Mark Twain house and the Harry Beecher Stowe's house. And there's 6 Victorians, and then all around is low-income housing, a low-rise, very poor neighborhood. And it's just interesting because you can reflect on what happened with that and how the economy has changed and what the desirability of that neighborhood is. So the first thing I do when I go to a house is just sort of look at the overall environment. And then I just look at the things that I try to find things I've never seen before. So once you've seen a lot of houses and you really are interested in it, you always are looking for the thing that you've never seen before. And so I'm always on the hunt for something new and little quirky details, things like that.
Recently, what's something quirky detail that you liked?
So it was funny because at Harry Beecher Stowe's house, I was there and I was walking through the house as part of the tour, and the tour guide is talking about Harry Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin and all these things. And obviously it's an interesting story, but I'm much more interested in the architecture of the building. And I'm walking through and I stopped in my tracks because I looked at the door and it was a hematite doorknob. And hematite,
what the heck is that?
Hematite is material that was made in the Victorian era, and it's made of sawdust and ox blood. So they would take blood and mix it with, like literal blood, mix it with sawdust and compress it into patterns. And so the doorknobs were made of sawdust and blood.
And you knew that right away when you saw it?
As soon as I saw it, you could just, I'd seen videos, I'd read about hematite, but I never actually seen it in person.
And is that because like dorky teenage Joe Himali on This Old House saw hematite with Bob Vila, or it came from somewhere else?
That came from having been on YouTube, on TikTok. And I watched one from a place in Portland, Oregon called Hippo Hardware. And Hippo Hardware is another architectural salvage yard, and they said, have you ever seen these before? Here are hematite doorknobs. Like, I've never heard of hematite. And then of course I Googled it and went down the rabbit hole to learn all about hematite. And then I was like, boy, I really love to see that one day. And then when I saw it, I was just stopped in my tracks, and I was clearly gobsmacked because the rest of the tour turned back, and I'm just standing there with slack jawed looking at this doorknob, and the rest of the group is looking at me like, what is wrong with this man? I'm like, do you know what this is? And the tour guide, like, what are you talking about? It's just a doorknob. I'm like, it's not just a doorknob. And I explained it. I told a little bit about the history of hematite, and then the rest of the group was like, wow. And the tour guide was equally impressed. And that's the sort of stuff that I look for. So
fantastic.
That's
I've never heard of hematite. It sounds like a race of beings from Star Trek. I mean, it's a fantastic name. So,
yes.
Which now gives me the label of dork, because I called you a dork, and now I mentioned Star Trek, so I'm a dork.
Yeah.
So fellow Trekkie. Dork.
Yes.
Trekkie, total Trekkie.
Yes.
So that's great answers to those questions, Joe. A second question. This is from Sugar Snap Peas at Sugar Snap Peas, which is a fantastic label.
Right.
The oldest building you have sold ever.
So the oldest building,
because you've been at this. Before you answer that, Joe, let's just take a step back. My apologies. You have been at this business. You have been selling real estate and helping buyers buy real estate for what? 2 decades?
25 years.
20. So it's your silver anniversary.
Yes, quarter century.
So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes you have sold in those.
About 1,200 homes. Now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So of those 1,200 homes, now that we have some perspective, the oldest.
The oldest one that I have personally sold was built in 1835. And that was a house in Georgetown. And it's an interesting house. It's really not much to look at from the street. But it was the first house built on the block. You can tell because it's pushed out from the rest of them. So as time went on, they put setbacks in. The setback is a requirement that a house has to be built a certain distance from the street. But this house was old enough that there was no setback requirement at the time. So it was very close to the street. And then the steps leading to the front door are actually built on public land, because the property starts right at the front of the building, and it doesn't have a front yard. And I went into that house, and the first thing I noticed in that house was that the floors were half sawn lumber. So it was literally, they would take a log, and these were big logs, 18 inches, 20-inch wide logs, just cut them in half, turn each half of the log down, and put them on the floor. So that was the floor. So it wasn't the way we construct things now, where you have a joist and then a plank on top. No, it was literally just half a log was the floor. So the floor was just half timber.
So if you went under the floor, you would see the
curve. Yeah, exactly.
curve.
You'd see the curves. They stripped the bark off, but it would just be raw tree underneath.
So if I were in a basement, would that be what I would see?
Yeah. Yes. You would literally see that if you looked underneath it on the floors, which is pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I love my basement to look like that.
it's pretty fun.
Yeah,
and then so it was really fun. And the clapboard siding on it was also interesting because on that building, it used to be with clapboard siding that they would actually bring the clapboards closer and closer together the closer you are to the ground, so it had more thickness, I guess. I'm not sure the exact purpose of it, but as the clapboards went up, they get wider and wider apart as you go up the building. So it had that detail in it too. But other than that, it was just a federal style little place, and it was originally just a working man's, house, and but that's the oldest house they've actually sold.
Almost 200 years old.
Yeah, very nearly 200 years old now. Yeah.
And Sugar Snap Peas has a follow-up.
Okay.
Sugar Snap Peas had a lot of good questions, by the way. I picked another one of Sugar Snap Peas later on.
Okay.
So the oldest home featured ever in any of your videos?
I think I'm pretty sure that the oldest would be the Nicholas Flamel house. Nadia, does that sound right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So Nadia agreed. So Nicholas.
So it has to be right.
Yeah, it has. Well, you ask the smart women in your life the questions, you get the answers,
you
and
get
then
the
you
right
know
answers.
Right. Exactly. So that house was in Paris. I was in Paris on a field trip and did videos while I was there, because every time I travel, I always am out there doing video. And the Nicholas Flamel house, he's known because if you read Harry Potter, the first book, The Sorcerer's Stone, or if you're in the UK,
thought that name sounded familiar.
Yeah, if you're in the UK, it's the Philosopher's Stone.
Right.
Yes. So in that book, there's a guy named Nicholas Flamel, who I always assumed was just made up by J.K. Rowling, but he was in fact an actual alchemist. And he actually was an alchemist in Paris in the early 1400s, and he had this house built. And it's a really interesting exterior on the house. He apparently was trying to convert base metals, lead, into gold. And he did find out how to get gold, which is that he just married a very wealthy woman. So his name was Prunell Flanell.
What was it?
Prunell.
Prunell
Flanell.
Flanell.
Yes.
Okay.
So Prunell Flamel. Sorry, Prunell Flamel was Nicholas Flamel's wife, and she was a very wealthy woman. When Nicholas died, he actually made that house into housing for the destitute and the poor. So it's still, I believe, the upper floors are still housing for the destitute in the middle of, I think it's the 8th arrondissement. And underneath, it's actually now a Michelin-starred restaurant.
And when were you there?
I was there in January.
In January.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
It was very
hundreds
cool.
and hundreds and hundreds of years old.
Yeah, it's 600 and something years old now. Yeah,
it's incredible.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah, it's one thing to say you sold a house in Georgetown that's almost 200 years old, but to think of something being 600 years old.
So there's a person that I know. She is the caretaker of one of the historic buildings in DC, and she's from the UK. And she said, it's not really an old house. And I said, well, what do you consider to be an old house? She said, well, the house that I grew up in was actually the rectory of a church from pre-Norman, so before 1066. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a lot older than anything here. But, not the oldest house, but I think the oldest thing that I've shot a video of is probably in Florida, because in Florida they have piles of remnants from the native peoples there that are over 4,000 years old. So they're called middens, middens, and it's called a shell midden. And when the native peoples that were here would just throw all of the shells into a pile, and it got to be so high that from the ground level to the height of the midden would be about 20 feet tall. So they were literally 4,000-year-old shell middens. That's the oldest thing that I shot a video of, but not the oldest house.
And where was that?
That's in Florida, so in Jupiter, Florida, which it's known now for its mega yachts and very wealthy people. But yeah, so shell middens.
And known for Joe Himali videos.
Yeah, now known as for its Joe Himali videos. Yes.
You get around.
Yeah, I try.
You really do. This is also from Sugar Snap Peas. Sugar Snap Peas, I clearly like your questions, so keep sending them in future Q&As. How did the walking tours start, Joe?
Well, the walking tours came about because I actually started doing videos online, started posting videos on social media. And I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of good followers and very loyal followers. Thank you. And they would reach out to me after I reached a certain level. At that time, I don't know, about 40,000 followers at that moment. And then people would just say, "Hey, I'd love to meet with you." And I'm like, "I don't know why you'd want to meet with me. I didn't really understand it." And one day
I understand it.
Oh, well, that's very nice of you to say. Thank you. So I was driving through Calorama with Nadia, who you can't see, but Nadia and I were driving through Calorama, and I think Nadia was tired of me telling her stories about all the buildings as we drove along for the millionth time, because she can attest that as we drive along, like, "Did you know about this and this and this?" And Nadia said, "You should do a tour. You should do a walking tour." And I was like, "Oh, that's what we should do. We could do a walking tour, which combines my ability to just talk about architecture, and I can meet the people that want to meet with me." And this two came together. And then my daughter was basically now very pleased that I do that, because if I start talking to my kid about architecture as you drive along, my kid will just say, "You could just talk about that on your tour. That's okay. I don't need to hear about it."
All right. It's a way for her not to have to listen to you go on and on about doorknobs.
Right, exactly. Or the difference between a gargoyle and a grotesque and all that sort of stuff.
Which I know the answer because I've been on your tours.
Exactly.
Which is in your Calorama tour.
It is. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there are 4 tours right now, correct?
Yeah, there are 4. The first one we started on was a Calorama. And we do mostly Beaux-Arts architecture and things built in the turn of from the 19th to the 19th, 20th century, early 20th century architecture. And then the second one I started doing was Georgetown. And my Georgetown's a little different from most Georgetown tours because it's more about the waterfront. And, we touch on JFK, but it's not really going and seeing his house and that sort of stuff. And in Georgetown, if you're south of M Street, that's really the working part of Georgetown, as opposed to the beautiful mansions that are up in the northern part on the East Village or West Village. So most tours are in the villages, the East or West Village, and not many of them are down at the waterfront. So we talk about that.
It's a real contrast, the Georgetown tour. And trust me, I've been on all the tours. It's a real contrast going on the Georgetown tour versus the Calorama tour, which I think makes it very unique.
Yeah.
Experience.
Yeah. And it's also, Georgetown's up and down stairs and alleys and all that sort of stuff, which you don't get in the other tours. Then the third tour I started doing was Tenleytown, because most people have never heard of Tenleytown or know what it is. And it's the second oldest neighborhood in DC. It's intricately connected to Georgetown. And it's got a really fascinating history. And you wouldn't think driving through Tenleytown there'd be anything to talk about. But if you do that tour, there's a lot more. And it gives you a lot more respect for Tenleytown, because a lot of people think of it as sort of just a place where there's a Whole Foods in a parking garage, And then
it also ends in a fantastic way.
It doesn't.
The last part of the Tenleytown tour is my favorite. It's a really unique experience, and everyone's always wondering, well, why are we going this way?
Right.
And then you realize at the very end why you are.
Yeah.
So it's a great one.
We're not going to tell you what it is.
No, of course not. You
Yes.
got to go.
Right.
And you'll get to meet Joe in person, and I'll probably be there too.
Yes.
So there you go.
And then the last tour that I just started doing, that we've only done it once, but we're just starting it, is in Southwest, which again is a very different tour. Oh, so going back, Tenleytown is interesting because it has a variety of properties that range from, early 1800s to today. And especially it goes really into a lot about Cold War and that sort of stuff. But Southwest is really about mid-century modern. So for a lot of people that are into mid-century modern, which is a very popular style now, the Southwest tour is really great. And we get to see things like the Titanic Memorial, which is an interesting story behind that, and get to see a really cool pond at the end, which you wouldn't think there'd be a cool pond in Southwest Washington, but there is.
I have to admit, I've lived in DC for many years, but I've never been to that part of Southwest until the tour. I didn't even know there were places like that in DC.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's truly remarkable and made me feel very ignorant as well. But great tour.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And all of them get scheduled frequently. There are at least 2 a month, right?
2 a month.
Yep.
We do 2 a month, and I rotate through them. So if you miss one this month, it'll be coming up 2 months later, probably.
Right.
And we generally don't do them in the winter. So it's really just when the weather's a little.
Well, we have tried a couple of times.
We've done some, but sometimes in January it's warm.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, there were a couple last year in December that we did. We were a little nippy, but we got through it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then some people have actually done private tours with me too. So they've hired me, and we can go to group up to 20 and do a private tour of one of those 4 places as well. So we've done that too.
Yeah, those are fun too.
Yeah.
Nadia, are there any excellent questions in the chat? All right, I'm just going to move on to the next one that I have then. Okay, great. So this is one that you can spend a lot of time on. It's from Ron No Seal, C-E-E-L. Which DC area has the most interesting historic homes in your opinion? And you can, but feel free to like pick different areas and say what you like about their historic homes, so you don't feel like you're just choosing one.
Well, I really like LaDroit Park. LaDroit Park is an interesting neighborhood because LaDroit Park was considered to have been built in Washington County. So Washington, the city of Washington, was bounded by what was called Boundary Street, which is now Florida Avenue. So everything south of Florida Avenue is considered Washington City.
And that's just north of Florida Avenue, right?
It's literally directly across. It's on the north side of Florida Avenue, but that was considered the country. You know, like it's interesting now. You think of Florida Avenue as not the country, but at the time that was considered the country. And there's a lot of beautiful Victorian architecture. There's an outstanding example of Italianate architecture and some other really beautiful, beautiful homes. It was a gated community to begin with, and has a reflection of the very checkered history of race in Washington. It started only as a whites-only area, then became all African-American.
Thank you for letting us know, by the way, in chat. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Can you see us again?
I can see you on here.
All right,
Excellent,
so
excellent. So imagine you could buy any house in DC and live there for as long as you want. It doesn't have to be the rest of your life. Where would you pick?
That's impossible to answer.
What
Because
neighborhood would you pick?
I wouldn't pick the neighborhood. It's really about the house, because what I like to find are old houses that are interesting and quirky and hopefully a little bit dilapidated or very dilapidated, and bring them back so I could restore them. That's what would really make me happy. The best example of that would be like the Hyrick Mansion, which is in DuPont, which obviously is not for sale, and it's, you know, home a museum. But if that house came for sale, which it was for sale in like 2005
When you were a realtor.
when I was a realtor, and it was $5.5 million in 2005, which would be the equivalent of like 11 million now. And sadly, I don't have $11 million to spend on a house. But if I had it at that time, I would have bought the Hyrick Mansion for sure.
And someone bought it and then made it into a museum?
Yeah, it had been part of the DC Historic Society. That's where their headquarters was, and now it's the Hyrick House Museum, I believe, is what it's called.
And beer garden.
What's that?
And beer garden.
And beer garden. It's a beer garden too.
It's a beer garden as well. For
Yeah.
$5.5 million, they made a beer garden.
Yeah. Well, back in those days, yes,
Right,
yes.
right.
That was 20 years ago.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Anything on the chat? Any good questions there, Nadia, to ask? I'm going to ask one more,
Okay.
and then we'll announce the prizes and we'll wrap it up for our first show.
Okay.
Can you believe it's almost been 30 minutes?
No.
Time flies, at
It
least
does.
for us. Maybe
Yeah.
not for all of you. For us, it has.
Yes.
So I think I like this one at Chris Seabee,
Okay.
S-E-B-E-E. Where did you grow up?
So I was born in Washington, D.C. I was born at GW Hospital, and then I move a lot. So when I was young, I grew up with my parents, obviously, and they lived in inner Montgomery County.
Were your parents born here?
No, my parents were born in other parts of the country, but they came here because of the National Institutes of Health. So they came here because my father did research at NIH, and so that's why they moved to DC, and that's why I was born here. So I was born here, grew up in inner Montgomery County within the Beltway mostly, and then I went to school at Edmund Burke, which is in Van Ness, technically Forest Hills, and then as soon as I graduated from college, I moved into the city. So I've lived all over the place. I've lived in Calorama and Cathedral Heights and Tenleytown and Cleveland Park, and I don't know.
I mean, you're one of the few people I know who's lived here his entire life.
Other than the 3 years I was off at college.
Right,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I've known I know a lot of people in Washington, but I know very few people who were born here, raised here, have lived most of their life here. So.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a fun place, but I would not buy in a particular neighborhood. The neighborhood is not really of much interest to me as the actual house. So finding a house that's old and a little bit run down that I can restore, because I don't really want to, buy a house that's already been done by somebody else.
Right.
And if I could find a really cool split level at this point, which is generally considered the least desirable style of architecture right now.
Why do you like split levels?
Well, I like split levels because you're usually they're very mid-century, so a lot of them haven't been renovated. I'd love to find one and sort of restore it with the mid-century architecture. So the Formica countertops with a little metal strip on the side, which is awesome. They look beautiful. They're completely impractical, but it looks spectacular. You know, with those the atomic lights and things like it's all very, you know, Mad Men sort of the early Mad Men era. Is be a lot of fun to restore that.
Yeah, that would be fascinating to do that. I have a feeling you'll do something like that one day.
Yeah, hopefully soon.
All right, now you got to give away your prizes. We're going to give away 2. I'm going to remind you the questions, and you're going to pick 2. All right. So the first one was discovering your passion for architecture, Gabriella. The second one was 2 from Sugar Snap Peas, the oldest buildings you have sold, etc. Or how did you start the walking tours? We also asked the question of what's the most interesting historic homes in the DC area? Which areas have the most historic homes? And then where did you grow up?
Right.
So of those, who do you want to give the prizes to? And I'll announce who they are.
Obviously, Sweet Pea needs to get.
Sweet Peas, you get a prize.
Yes.
So we will send you those playing cards.
Right.
And then the other one?
I'll let Nadia decide. Nadia, what do you think?
Which one?
So my favorite question that was not asked, that was submitted earlier, was from TJT Wyatt on Instagram, and it was, which of your videos was the hardest to record apart from Rock Creek?
Oh,
so let's make this the prize and answer it as your final question.
So final question is, which was the hardest video for me to shoot other than Rock Creek Park? Rock Creek Park was not actually all that hard a video to shoot. It just was, you know, dry cleaning bill. So it wasn't actually difficult to walk through. Although I did almost fall over because that creek was moving. So the first time I started walking through it, I didn't realize how strong the current was, and I did almost fall through. So that was interesting. But I think it was probably when we saw the great tree, the American. What was the name of that?
When I made you climb a tree.
Yes, Nadia said, "Wouldn't it be funny if you climbed the tree in your suit?" So I climbed the tree, and it's shot with me standing in a tree that I had to climb up. So that was probably the most difficult video that I had to shoot. On the other hand, we've also done things, you know, where when we were looking at a place out in Rockville, that was a Pope designed house. And I was crawling through the crawl space in the attic in a suit and that sort of stuff. But, you know,
always in a suit.
Always in a suit.
Yeah.
Always in a suit when I've got my uniform on.
And after this show, what do you have for everyone?
So right after the show, we actually have a video launching right now about this studio. This area where I'm shooting is part of my house, and had my old bachelor furniture in it. And I hired Tyler Whitmore Interiors. Tyler and Debbie came in here and reimagined the space and created a studio for me. So I'd like to give a shout out to Tyler and to Debbie and thank them for their wonderful work, because otherwise we wouldn't have this little studio to shoot in. So check that video out. It's a lot of fun. You can see how the whole process works and see how they work and see their warehouse and see them sewing the pillows. It's crazy, all the stuff they did for this. It's fun.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Joe, for our inaugural Best Addressed show, the Best Addressed show. It was a lot of fun. Look for information on the next show next month. It'll be Joe, it'll be me, and we'll figure something out that'll be exciting for all of you. Joe, thanks a lot.
Thank you.